Today's speaker sort of represents a number of things, but among them maybe that it's always important maybe to inquire about people's histories, because we don't always know everything about one another. You know somebody in one walk of life and assume, well, then they're this or they believe this or whatever, and little do you know that they have a whole nother dimension and history that makes their life even more interesting. And such is the case with Gene Livingston, because we know that he is a well-known advocate, lobbyist here, and a shareholder with the Greenberg Traurig firm, and founded Livingston Madisage in 1982 and was Governor Brown's, in his first round, Governor Brown's chief deputy and acting director of the EDD, and the first director of the Office of Administrative Law. Well, for a variety of reasons, I got to know Gene in a slightly different way, and found out that prior to his work in and with the state of California, that he was one of the leading United States attorneys prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan during the height of the Civil Rights era. He began his legal career as a trial attorney with the Civil Division of the U.S. Department of Justice in 1965. And for 3.5 years, he was intimately and actively involved in enforcing the post-civil rights statutes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And you'll hear about a number of the cases he was involved in. But he was one of the lead counsels in prosecuting the killers of the 3 Mississippi civil rights workers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, who tragically were killed, assassinated in 1964. He was part of the prosecution team that prosecuted the Klan and the killing of Vernon Dahmer. I'll let Gene tell the story, but I happened to meet Vernon Dahmer's wife and family. Vernon Dahmer was an African-American man who had not much wealth, but he had a little store. And before it became, and even after it became illegal to deny African-Americans the right to vote, Vernon Dahmer would pay the $1 poll tax for African-Americans who couldn't afford it. As a result of his simple act of justice, his home was firebombed in, I believe, 1965 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. His whole family escaped from the burning home. Mr. Dahmer himself escaped as well, but he later died of smoke inhalation. And it's one of many stories of people who were sort of unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. We all know Dr. King, and we know a few other of the great stories, but there's so many stories we don't know. And I just thought it would be very valuable and important for the Senate in this still contentious time. We've made great progress, but Lord, how much progress, how much a long way we still have to go. To hear about some of that history in our lifetime from our friend Gene Livingston. Welcome, Gene. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to share with the members of the Senate some of the issues that I was involved in the 60s in the South. My story really begins early in 1965. I had accepted a job with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. I finished law school. I was sworn in to the Oklahoma Bar, my home state, and the same day that I was sworn in, I loaded all of my belongings in the trunk and back seat of my car and headed east toward D.C. I started work on a Monday, August 2nd, 1965. 2 days later, I took a flight to New Orleans, rented a car, and drove up to Bogalusa, Louisiana, in Washington Parish. I went to Bogalusa to help develop evidence to support a lawsuit that our division had filed against the original Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan in Bogalusa was dominating social and political activities. They were terrorizing many residents, not just African Americans, but whites as well. If, for example, a group of African Americans went to a restaurant to seek service, a right that was provided by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Klan members would descend on them, drive them away with baseball bats, clubs, and often with shotguns and rifles, and then turn their attention to the owner of the restaurant and say, if you ever serve an African American, of course that's not the term they used, you will be next. We will bring down on you both economic and physical harm. The same thing happened if African Americans went to the courthouse to attempt to register to vote. Again, the Klan would come, drive them away, and turn to the registrar and say, if you ever register an African American, you will be next. We had filed a motion for preliminary injunction against the Klan, and the hearing on that motion was being conducted in New Orleans in the Federal District Court. While we were conducting that hearing, in the middle of it, Hurricane Betsy strikes New Orleans and many other parishes in southern Louisiana. During the break in the hearing, the FBI got information from an informant that a particular Klansman had a list of the entire membership of the original Knights in the Bogalusa area. We had been trying for weeks to get that list to be part of our lawsuit. I was tasked with the assignment of returning to Bogalusa, locating that Klansman, he lived in the country, serving with a subpoena to bring the list to federal court whenever the court resumed. Now, I grew up in a rural area, and I'm familiar with unpaved country roads and rural routes and boxes and so on, but what I had not anticipated was trees and highline poles knocked down by the hurricane and blocking the roads in many instances. But eventually, I found his house, and later I was able to serve him, and he showed up in court with a list of the entire membership. The significance of that was that the injunction then ran against individuals and not just the organization, and we exposed to the entire community the membership of the Klan. One of the portion of the order that the judge issued was to prohibit the Klansmen from interfering with the rights of African Americans to register. The President Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 while we were developing the evidence in Bogalusa. And so the order included enforcement of a significant provision, Section 2 of that act. From the date that President Johnson signed the law on August 6, 1965, until the end of the year, 250,000 African Americans registered to vote in the states of the Old South. And I'd like to tell you that the passage of that bill ended the attempts to interfere with African Americans to register to vote. Unfortunately, it did not. As the pro tem indicated, only 5 months later, 2 carloads of Klansmen from the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, located in Laurel, Mississippi, in Jones County, drove to the rural area outside of Hattiesburg in the adjoining Forest County and firebombed Vernon Damer's home. And as the pro tem indicated, Mr. Damer stood in a picture window of his house that had been broken by the firebombs, firing his rifle at the attackers to fend them off so that his wife and children could escape out the back of the house. In that process, Mr. Damer inhaled flames and then died the next day from his burns. His oldest son, Vernon Damer Jr., obtained a special leave from the U.S. Army to attend his father's funeral. I was in Hattiesburg the night that this attack occurred. In fact, I had an appointment to meet with Mr. Damer the next morning. Mr. Damer, as the pro tem indicated, was a relatively successful businessman. He had a grocery store, a sawmill, and actually had a 200-acre farm. He kept in his grocery store a voter registration book and offered patrons, mostly African Americans, an opportunity to register to vote. And as the pro tem indicated, he would pay the poll tax himself for registrants who could not afford to pay that tax. That, of course, is the reason that Sam Bowers, the head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, authorized the Klansmen to take care of Vernon Dahmer. It was many years later, however, before the people who killed Vernon Dahmer were actually brought to justice. I was involved in going through the FBI reports, presenting the case to a federal grand jury, but we never obtained a federal jury to convict his attackers. Later, many years later, the state brought charges against them. Later that year, later in 1966, in June, I joined a number of colleagues in a meeting in Memphis, Tennessee, with John Doerr, who was head of the Civil Rights Division. The purpose of the meeting was to talk about our role in implementing the 65 Voting Rights Act in the upcoming primary elections in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. While we were meeting, James Meredith, who was the first African American to attend Ole Miss, began a march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi, a march against fear, a march to encourage African Americans to register to vote. As he reached the outer limits of Memphis, he was shotgunned. Other civil rights leaders came in, picked up his cause, and continued the march. Many hundreds and then later thousands of people joined that march. And as they went through the towns and the cities, headed south to Jackson, many incidences of violence against the marchers and other African Americans in those cities and towns occurred. One of those in particular was Grenada, Mississippi. After the marchers had left, the local African Americans continued to demonstrate for the right to register to vote. Now, they marched at night. They did that so that people who worked during the day could join the demonstration. After several nights of violence, I was assigned to go to Grenada to get a first-hand account of what's going on in Grenada. I joined the marchers that night. They started out in the black section of Grenada and walked toward the town square. Now, the town square in Grenada was like the town squares in most county seat towns in Mississippi. It was about a half a block in size, and in the middle of the square was a Confederate statue, and it was a park-like setting. And then surrounding the square were stores with sidewalks across the street from the square. As we reached the square, I noticed, and it was impossible not to notice, that the entire square was ringed by white men standing there just waiting, standing shoulder to shoulder. And as we got into the square, they began throwing half bricks, broken bottles, and shooting ball bearings with slingshots into the group of marchers. My first inclination was to find a place to hide. You could hear the ball bearings whistling through the trees and seeing them hit in the streets and ricocheting. And I saw a line of police in one of the streets, and I ran out to the line to the end that I thought where the head of the police was. And I said, "You've got to do something. You've got to stop this." And what I got instead was a derisive laughter, and then, "Who do you think you are, boy?" They did nothing, and the attacks continued until the marchers retreated, many of them bleeding and many of them having to be hospitalized after that. Later, we obtained an injunction against the law enforcement from failing and refusing to protect the rights of the demonstrators. As the pro tem indicated, probably the most significant case I worked on was the murder of the 3 civil rights workers in Neshoba County, Mississippi. And I am more modest than to say I was one of the lead attorneys. I was on the trial staff that helped prosecute 18 Klansmen for conspiring to violate the civil rights of Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman. I also helped develop the evidence that we presented to a federal grand jury securing the indictments against them. The trial occurred in October 1967, but the story really begins in January of 1964 when Michael Schwerner and his wife Rita moved from New York City to Meridian, Mississippi to help further the rights of African Americans registering to vote in Mississippi. Now, Schwerner was Jewish and he wore a goatee, and the Klan derisively referred to him as the Jew boy goatee. And again, the head of the Klan authorized the elimination of Michael Schwerner. Now, Schwerner had visited an all-black church in eastern Neshoba County and had talked to the parishioners about setting up a freedom school, a place where people could be taught how to pass the literacy test to enhance their chances of being registered to vote. The local law enforcement, all members of the Klan, knew about his visit to that church. And as a consequence, the entire clavern, which is what the Klan calls their various chapters, knew about Michael Schwerner being at that church. So they staked out the church. There was some Klansmen watching that church much of the time. One night, one Klansman saw activity at the church. Now, it was a routine prayer meeting, but the Klansman didn't know it and assumed that Schwerner was there. He sent out the word, organized a group of men from Neshoba County and also from Meridian, the county, the principal city to the south of Neshoba County. And 8 or 9 people descended on the church. And as the service ended and the parishioners left the church, the Klansmen began beating them with clubs and some with steel pipes, causing serious injuries. They did not find Schwerner, so they set fire to the church and burned it to the ground to send a message to him. Now, Schwerner was in Oxford, Ohio at this time. He was participating in a training camp of students who were going to join the Freedom Summer Project in the South that summer. He heard about the beatings and the burning and hurried back to Mississippi. The day after he returned, he, along with James Chaney, an African American from Meridian, and Andrew Goodman, a student who had just joined, had been at Oxford and had just come to Meridian, drove to Neshoba County in their Ford station wagon. They met with the parishioners, gathered as much information as they could. Schwerner obviously felt bad, felt guilty about having caused this event by having visited with them previously. As he was returning, as they were driving back to Meridian, they had to pass through Philadelphia. And just east of Philadelphia, Cecil Price, the deputy sheriff of Neshoba County, stopped them, arrested them, and locked them up in the county jail. Price then immediately told the head of the Neshoba County Klan, a minister who went by Preacher Killen, that he had Schwerner in jail. Killen then organized a number of people to, quote, do a job, both in Neshoba County, and then he drove to Meridian and organized another 4 or 5 people. They agreed to meet near the courthouse late that night. Around 10:30, Price then released the 3 civil rights workers from the jail. They got in their Ford station wagon and headed south on Highway 19 toward Meridian. 3 cars pull in behind them and start following them. Now, they must have realized that they were being followed. Chaney was driving, and at one point he pulls off on a secondary road. His family speculated that since he had a relative who lived down that road, that perhaps they were headed there to find a safe place to be. But shortly after they turned off on that road, Price turned on his red light, they stopped. Price ordered them to get in his car. And as the 3 civil rights workers were walking toward his car, Price takes his blackjack and hits Cheney hard on the head with a blackjack. They load them up in the back seat of the car, turn the cars around, head back to Highway 19, turn back to Philadelphia, drive a short distance, and then turn west again on a dirt road. They drive about a mile, and they stop. Now, there were 3 cars. Wayne Roberts, a Klansman from Meridian, was in the 3rd car. As soon as the car stopped, he jumps out of the car, runs up to the left side of Price's car, pulls open the rear door, grabs Schwerner, pulls him out, and swings him around, and says to him, "You in-lover." Schwerner says, "Sir, I know just how you feel," and Roberts shot him in the chest. Roberts then ran around to the other side of the car, grabbed Andrew Goodman, pulled him over to the left side, spun him around, and shot him in the chest as well. James Cheney jumped out of the car and made a run for it and was gunned down by James Jordan and by Wayne Roberts. The Klansmen loaded the bodies in the Ford station wagon, and they drove to a rural area where an earthen dam was being constructed. Now, when you build an earthen dam, you start first with a trench so that the dirt that's stacked up will adhere to dirt below the surface where the water will be, so the water won't run under the dam. They dumped the bodies in the trench, and then the operators of the Caterpillar who was building the dam started up the Caterpillar and began pushing dirt in over the bodies, running over the bodies a number of times in the process. There are many aspects to this crime, the investigation, and the grand jury indictments and the trial that I could share with you. But what we were able to accomplish there was that a Southern jury convicted 7 of 18 Klansmen for conspiring to interfere with the civil rights of Michael Schwerner, James Cheney, and Andrew Goodman. These stories that I've shared with you are just a few examples of the acts of violence that went on in the South during this time. And as I think about those stories today, I have to wonder, why is it that so many had to suffer so much for a right that is so basic? But that's our history. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gene, for the compelling and still breathtaking stories that you tell. It's hard to believe in our lifetime.
It is.
I'd like to give an opportunity for members to be able to ask questions, if you will, or to ask about, any of what you said. Senator Jackson?
Yes, thank you. And some of us here do remember that time, and I can't help but continue to shake my head in disbelief at what went on. I'm wondering, obviously the only way justice was able to be dispensed was through the federal judiciary. Going to the state courts would have been a waste of time. Based on your subsequent experience, would you say that the federal courts today would still be as protective, given the politics of the day, should those cases then have been brought today?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, Senator Jackson. It was a mixed bag even then. The judge who presided over the murder of the 3 civil rights workers was Judge Cox. And Senator Eastland, a senator from Mississippi, wanted Senator Cox, who had been his roommate in law school, appointed to the bench. And that was part of the agreement that Johnson and Kennedy made to get the Southern vote for the Democrats in 1960. He was a very difficult person. I had many encounters with him. But on the other hand, you had Judge Frank Johnson over in Montgomery, Alabama, who people respected greatly and was viewed as very fair and willing to take a significant chance in order to enforce the law. So I suspect that today you would probably find a mix as we had then as well. I still have confidence in the judiciary, but you're right about the state courts. In Neshoba County, they convened a grand jury to subpoena all of the data that we had, all the evidence that we had gathered, because they wanted to share it with the suspects at the time. And of course, we refused to turn that over to the grand jury. But they wanted to work against what we were trying to accomplish.
Thank you, Gene, very much for sharing your history with us today. Going back to that first story you told us about where you subpoenaed a Klansman who almost as a whistleblower act provided the entire membership of the local clans. Number one, do you know what inspired him to let it be known that he had the list so that he would be subpoenaed? And secondly, do you know if there was any retribution against him by his local clans subsequent to that?
Okay. I don't know that he necessarily was inspired to reveal that he had the list. I think his position was at Kliegel, which is kind of the secretary, and so he maintained the list. And the Klan was very structured. They would give a number to every member, and they were numbered sequentially. And so you could ask a Klansman, what was your number? And they would tell you your number. The FBI, after ignoring these kinds of violations for a number of years and more concerned about civil rights efforts than they were about Klan's terrorist acts, did a pretty good job of infiltrating the Klan. And there are a number of stories where the informants brought information to the attention. I mean, the bodies were buried in a dam. And again, it was somebody just talking a little too much and some informant picking that up through some of the Klan meetings that brought to the FBI's attention where the bodies were buried and so on. So it was more the infiltration by the Bureau. I don't know of any. I don't know of any.
Feel a danger to your own life, or any stories about the investigations themselves that revealed the challenge of being able to do your job in such an environment?
It's interesting. I felt physically at risk in Grenada when those bricks and bottles and ball bearings were flying through the air. We were not supposed to travel alone, and I was in Neshoba County several times by myself, and I left usually after sundown. And anytime a car started following me, I would be a little nervous. But the other aspect of that is that in most of the counties where I worked, I would meet local lawyers, and we would become actually friends. And so I felt some confidence about having relationships among the whites as well as among the African Americans. And then the other thing, I guess, that's important is, I was 25 when I started. You're immortal. And so you don't think about bad things happening.
Thank you again for just reminding us about the importance of history. It's very compelling. Thank you, Gene.
And thank you.